So I would like to review the definition of ions and the definition of cation and anion and how they're formed. In a future video, we'll talk about the patterns and how we can predict the ions for and specifically the main group elements is what we'll be working on. But I just want to review a little bit of the language. So ions, you can see there their definition is they're just charged particles. And an important thing to remember is that we form ions by gaining or losing electrons. So in an atom, there's the particles, the subatomic particles that we consider in chemistry are protons, electrons, and neutrons. And we have the protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and then we have the electrons outside the nucleus in the electron clouds. Now, the two charged particles in an atom are protons, which are positive, and electrons, which are negative. And for an atom, which is neutral, the positive and the negative are equal, so they cancel itself out. Remembering neutrons don't have a charge, so that won't affect or impact the charge of the atom or of the ion. So a neutral atom has equal protons and electrons. So when an atom becomes an ion and gets a charge, it loses electrons or gains electrons. Now, we can't change the number of protons for a specific element because, remember, the protons or the number of protons are what give the identity to the element. So in forming ions, the number of protons wouldn't change because you'd be changing elements. And so that's not going to happen in the formation of an ion. So all we can do are add or gain electrons. And electrons are negative charge. So let's look at the language surrounding the gaining and losing electrons. So positive ions, you see here, are formed when you lose electrons. So electrons are negative charge. So if you lose electrons, you lose negative charge. We call positive ions cations. And right here are just examples of formulas of cations. So the first one is they're metals. Metals form cations. And you just see a calcium ion and a sodium ion. And then there's something called a polyatomic cation. Polyatomic ions are when you have multiple nonmetals bonded together that have a charge. So if it's a cation, in order for that to be stable, it's lost or transferred an electron. Remember, you don't gain and lose electrons in isolation. So if something is losing electrons, that electron is transferring to something else in the process. So you don't just lose electrons, you're transferring those electrons. Now, polyatomic ions we'll be learning about in a separate situation. So we can start to begin to know that they're here and that's something we're going to be thinking about, but it won't be addressed in our initial conversation of ionic bonding. Then we have anions, and so we look, anions are negative ions, and they're formed by gaining electrons. So again, we remind ourselves that electrons are negative charge. So if the atom gains negative charge, it's going to become negative. And we call negative ions anions. So there's some examples of what anions look like. Nonmetals are going to be the ones that form anions. So there's a chloride ion and an oxide ion. And then the majority of polyatomic ions are anions. So there's two examples of polyatomic anions. Now, on this slide, there's no explanation about why or how many electrons they lose or gain. We're going to think about that, but it's not on this slide. So what I want you to think about on this slide is the vocabulary. I want you to know what an ion is, what cations and anions are referring to, and it's very important that you realize that losing electrons creates positive ions and gaining electrons creates negative ions. The formation of the ionic bond occurs because opposite charges will attract. So once you have a positive ion and a negative ion from the transfer of the electron, those two ions attract each other, and that's what forms the ionic compound. So this is about vocabulary here. Now what I want you to practice is on this slide, and I have a periodic table that's kind of small on the slide, so if you have a periodic table that you can use, it might be easier. But what I want you to do is write the symbol for the ion represented by these examples. And I'm going to do the first one for you. Then you can pause the video, try to answer B and C, and then when you unpause the video, I will have the answers for you. So let's do letter A together. So remember, the number of protons is equal to the atomic number, and the atomic number is on the periodic table, so that can help us identify the actual element. So 22 protons would be number 22 right here, and so that would be titanium, which is Ti. Now, an atom of titanium would have 22 protons and 22 electrons because they would be equal. But I look here and I see this one only has 20 electrons, so it lost 2 electrons. Losing electrons creates a positive charge because you have more protons than you do electrons. So if you lose 2 electrons, it would create a 2 positive charge. So the answer for letter A, write the ion symbol for an atom with 22 protons and 20 electrons, would be Ti2+. So it formed that cation. All right, so pause the video. Try to get an answer for B and C. When you unpause the video, we'll go over the answers. All right, so hopefully you answered the question. So I would look here, there's 16 protons. So 16 is right here. It's sulfur, so I know this is going to be the element sulfur. I look, an atom of sulfur would have 16 proton and 16 electrons. They would be equal. But when I look here at 18, this particle has gained 2 electrons. So gaining electrons creates a negative charge because electrons are negative, and you would have more negative than you did positive from the protons. So since I gained 2 electrons, this would be S2 negative. And then letter C, 13 protons, so we go to number 13, that's aluminum. So that tells me the element is aluminum. Again, an atom would have 13 protons and 13 electrons. This only has 10. So the aluminum lost 3 electrons. When you lose electrons, you have a positive charge because you have more protons than electrons. And this element lost 3, so it would be aluminum with a 3 positive. So again, we don't know why from this slide something might be gaining or losing electrons. What we can recognize is that the 2 metals, titanium and aluminum, both lost electrons. Metals like to lose electrons, and the nonmetal sulfur gained electrons, and that's what nonmetals do. So we can recognize that. We can also start to name them as cations and anions and start to learn how to write the symbols for ions. In a future video, we're going to see why aluminum, for example, might want to lose its 3 electrons.